Milton Hershey built the most successful chocolate empire in American history, became one of the wealthiest men of his era, and died worth over $60 million. But when he died in 1945, the mansion he built for himself, High Point, sat empty. No children inherited it. No family lived there. And the reason it stayed empty reveals something most people never learn about extreme wealth: sometimes the money survives, but the person doesn't. This isn't a story about financial collapse. It's about something more unsettling. Milton Hershey didn't lose his fortune. He lost something else. And the mansion he built at the peak of his success became a monument to a very specific kind of loneliness that only extreme wealth can create. Because Hershey made a choice that most billionaires never make. He gave away his entire fortune while he was still alive. And what he got in return wasn't gratitude or legacy. It was isolation. Let's start with what Milton Hershey actually built, because the scale matters. In 1894, he launched the Hershey Chocolate Company after 2 previous business failures. By 1900, he had sold his caramel company for $1 million, about $35 million today, and bet everything on chocolate. But he didn't just make chocolate. He industrialized it. He turned a luxury product consumed by the rich into something every American child could afford. A Hershey bar cost a nickel. And that nickel, multiplied by millions, made Hershey unimaginably wealthy. By 1915, Hershey wasn't just running a company. He had built an entire town around his factory. Hershey, Pennsylvania. He owned the streets. He owned the homes. He owned the utilities, the department store, the bank, the schools. It wasn't a company town in the exploitative sense. It was a paternalistic empire. Hershey built parks, swimming pools, a theater, a sports arena. He paid good wages. He provided benefits. But make no mistake, he controlled everything. Every decision about how people lived, worked, and raised their families in that town went through him. And in 1908, at the height of his wealth and power, Milton Hershey built High Point. A mansion on a hill overlooking his factory and his town. It was designed to communicate permanence. 22 rooms. Elegant but not ostentatious. A statement that said, "I have built something that will last." But here's what most people don't know. Milton and his wife Catherine were never able to have children. And that biological reality would reshape everything about how Hershey thought about wealth and legacy. In 1915, Catherine became seriously ill. And in 1918, she died. Milton Hershey was 61 years old. He was worth tens of millions. He controlled a town, a company, and an empire. And he was alone in that mansion. No children. No heirs. No one to pass the kingdom to. If you're still watching, it's because you're starting to sense this isn't the story you expected. Now here's where the psychology gets complicated. Most wealthy men in Hershey's position would have remarried. They would have adopted. They would have found some way to create a lineage, because that's what wealth is supposed to do. It's supposed to extend your bloodline, your influence, your name into the future. But Milton Hershey didn't do that. Instead, he made a decision that almost no one in his position has ever made. In 1918, the same year his wife died, he transferred the entire Hershey Chocolate Company, not a portion, not a stake, but the entire controlling interest, to a trust. Specifically, to the Milton Hershey School, an institution he and Catherine had founded in 1909 to house and educate orphan boys. Let that sink in. Hershey gave away his company. While he was still alive. While he was still running it. He gave away his wealth to children who weren't his. And he did it in a way that was legally irreversible. He could never take it back. He could never sell it. He could never pass it to a biological heir even if one appeared. The wealth was gone. Locked into a trust designed to last forever. On paper, this looks like the most generous act in American business history. And in some ways, it was. But here's the mechanism most people miss. By giving away his wealth, Hershey didn't free himself. He trapped himself. Because he still ran the company. He still lived in the mansion. He still controlled the town. But he no longer owned any of it. He had become an employee of his own legacy. And that created a psychological prison that no amount of money could unlock. Here's what that looked like in practice. Hershey continued to work every day. He walked the factory floors. He approved new products. He made business decisions. But he couldn't profit from them. Every dollar the company made went to the school. He drew a salary, but it was a fraction of what he had given away. He lived in High Point, but the house now felt like a museum. Because it had been built for a family. It had been designed for children who never came. And now it was just him, alone, in 22 rooms he couldn't fill. And here's the part that makes this unbearable. Hershey couldn't even leave. Because if he sold High Point, if he moved away, if he stopped running the company, what would be left? His identity was fused with the empire he had built. He wasn't Milton Hershey the man. He was Milton Hershey the Chocolate King. And kings don't retire. They don't downsize. They don't admit that the castle has become a cage. So he stayed. He kept working. He kept walking through that empty mansion. And every year, the company grew. The school expanded. The trust accumulated more wealth. And Milton Hershey, the man who had created all of it, became more isolated. Because here's what happens when you give away everything while you're still alive. People stop seeing you as a person. They see you as a symbol. A saint. A monument. And monuments don't have needs. They don't have loneliness. They don't have regret. The town revered him. The workers respected him. The school carried his name. But no one was close to him. Not really. Because how do you get close to someone who has given away everything? How do you complain to someone who has sacrificed his own fortune for orphans? How do you tell someone like that you're tired, you're lonely, you're trapped? You don't. You just keep walking through the empty rooms. Here's the financial mechanism that people miss. When Hershey transferred the company to the trust, he created a structure that was legally brilliant but personally devastating. The trust owned the company. The company generated profits. The profits funded the school. The school grew. And the cycle continued. But there was no exit. Hershey couldn't sell his shares because he didn't own shares anymore. He couldn't dissolve the trust because it was irrevocable. He couldn't even appoint someone to take over in a meaningful way because the trustees controlled the structure, not him. What Hershey had done, in effect, was build a machine that would outlast him. And the machine worked perfectly. But he had forgotten to design a role for himself inside it. He had made himself obsolete in his own empire. Comment below if you've ever wondered what happens when legacy becomes a prison. Now let's talk about what happened during the Great Depression, because this is where the structure Hershey built revealed its deepest flaw. In 1929, the stock market collapsed. Banks failed. Fortunes evaporated overnight. But the Hershey Company didn't collapse. In fact, it thrived. Because chocolate was cheap. A Hershey bar still cost a nickel. And during the Depression, a nickel's worth of sweetness was one of the few luxuries people could still afford. So the company kept generating profits. The trust kept accumulating wealth. The school kept expanding. And Milton Hershey, who had structured everything to survive economic catastrophe, watched his creation succeed beyond his wildest projections. But here's the cruel irony. The more successful the company became, the less it needed him. The systems he had built were self-sustaining. The managers he had trained were competent. The trust operated according to its charter. And Hershey, the founder, became increasingly irrelevant to the machine he had created. He tried to stay involved. He toured the factory. He suggested product changes. He attended board meetings. But he wasn't the owner anymore. He was a respected figurehead. And there's a world of difference between those two roles. An owner can demand. A figurehead can only suggest. And slowly, year by year, decision by decision, Milton Hershey felt control slipping away from him. Not because anyone was trying to push him out. But because the structure he had built didn't require him anymore. And every night, he went home to High Point. To the mansion on the hill. To the 22 empty rooms. To the house that was supposed to be filled with children and grandchildren and the noise of a living legacy. But there was only silence. Because the legacy was happening somewhere else. In the school. In the company. In the town that bore his name but no longer needed his presence. Here's the psychological mechanism at work. Milton Hershey had built his entire identity around control and benevolence. He controlled the company, and he used that control to be benevolent to his workers, his town, his orphans. But when he gave away the company, he gave away the source of his benevolence. He could no longer be the generous king because he no longer owned the kingdom. He was just a man who had once been generous. And that past tense destroyed him. Because here's what people don't understand about philanthropists who give away everything. They're not just giving away money. They're giving away power. And power is identity. And identity is the only thing that makes loneliness bearable. When you're powerful, you can tell yourself the isolation is a choice. You're too busy. Too important. Too focused on your mission. But when the power is gone and the isolation remains, there's no story left to tell yourself. There's just the silence. By the 1940s, Milton Hershey was in his 80s. He was still living in High Point. Still walking to the factory. Still trying to be relevant in the empire he had created. But he was a ghost. A living relic. The workers respected him the way you respect a historical monument. With reverence, but not intimacy. With gratitude, but not connection. And here's the part that makes this story so different from other Gilded Age tragedies. Hershey didn't lose his money. The trust he created is still operating today. The Milton Hershey School is one of the wealthiest educational institutions in America, with an endowment worth billions. The Hershey Company is still thriving. The town still exists. The legacy is intact. But the man who built it died alone in a mansion he couldn't fill. On October 13, 1945, Milton Hershey died. He was 88 years old. And when he died, High Point didn't become a family home. It didn't pass to children or grandchildren. It couldn't, because there were none. Instead, it became what it had always secretly been. A museum. A monument. A place where people could tour the rooms where a great man had lived in isolation. If this is landing differently than you expected, it's because you're seeing the pattern now. Here's the question that should be disturbing you. Was Milton Hershey's choice noble or tragic? Did he sacrifice his personal happiness for the greater good, or did he make a structural error that turned his wealth into a cage? Because there's a version of this story where Hershey is a saint. He gave away everything for orphans. He built a school that still serves thousands of children. He created a company town with good wages and decent housing. He was the rare billionaire who actually redistributed his wealth. But there's another version where Hershey made a catastrophic miscalculation. He assumed that legacy could replace family. He thought that controlling a benevolent empire would feel the same as raising children. He believed that giving away his wealth would bring him peace. And it didn't. Because peace doesn't come from systems. It comes from connection. And Milton Hershey built the most sophisticated philanthropic system of his era while systematically eliminating every possibility for human connection. He couldn't remarry because who would want to marry a man who had given away his fortune? He couldn't adopt because the legal structures he had created made inheritance impossible. He couldn't even develop genuine friendships because how do you befriend someone who has positioned themselves as a living saint? Every relationship was asymmetrical. Every conversation was shadowed by what he had given away. And so he walked through High Point alone, night after night, surrounded by wealth that no longer belonged to him. Here's the mechanism that defines this entire story. Milton Hershey confused legacy with immortality. He thought that if he built something that lasted forever, he would last forever. But he didn't. He died. And the systems he created kept operating without him. The school didn't mourn him the way children mourn a father. The company didn't collapse the way empires collapse when their founders die. Everything just continued. Efficiently. Impersonally. Exactly as he had designed it. And that's the final cruelty. Milton Hershey succeeded. He built something permanent. But permanence doesn't care about you. It doesn't need you. And it definitely doesn't love you. Today, you can tour High Point. It's part of the Hershey Story Museum. You can walk through the same rooms where Milton Hershey lived alone for decades. You can see his office. His bedroom. The dining room table where he ate by himself. And the tour guides will tell you about his generosity. His vision. His legacy. They'll tell you he gave away his entire fortune. They'll tell you he changed thousands of lives. But they probably won't tell you that he spent the last 30 years of his life in a mansion that felt like a mausoleum. They won't tell you that he had engineered himself out of his own empire. They won't tell you that the same legal brilliance that made his philanthropy permanent also made his loneliness inescapable. Because that's not the story we want to hear about billionaires who give everything away. We want them to be happy. We want generosity to be rewarded with fulfillment. We want to believe that if you're good enough, selfless enough, visionary enough, you'll find peace. But Milton Hershey's empty mansion tells a different story. It says that you can give away everything and still die alone. It says that systems outlast people. And it says that legacy is a poor substitute for love. The irony is almost unbearable when you understand it fully. Hershey created a school for orphans because he and Catherine couldn't have children of their own. He poured his fortune into giving parentless children what he desperately wanted but couldn't have: a family structure, a home, a sense of belonging. But in doing so, he became an orphan himself. Not literally, but functionally. He orphaned himself from his own wealth, from the possibility of family, from any future that looked different than walking alone through High Point's empty halls. And the structure he created was so legally airtight, so brilliantly designed to be permanent, that he couldn't undo it even if he wanted to. Even in moments of doubt, even in the depths of loneliness, the machine kept running. The trust couldn't be dissolved. The school couldn't be closed. The company couldn't be reclaimed. He had built a perpetual motion machine and placed himself outside of it. If you've made it this far, you understand something most people never see about wealth and loneliness. Share this if it changed how you think about what billionaires actually sacrifice. Because Milton Hershey built something that will last centuries. But he couldn't build what he actually needed. And High Point, sitting empty on that hill, is the monument to everything money can't buy.